Hey nerdy knitters, Tanya here. Welcome to another episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Get your favorite beverage and your knitting, and let's settle in for a good chat. Now, I don't have too much for knitting news this week. I just came across one interesting article about a knitting nana who's knitting little chicks to hand out in the community and to local shelters. Now, this knitting nana is hoping to raise a few smiles by handing out 100 handmade chicks, each one with a Cadbury cream egg, to children in the community. Now, she donated to her local organization, the Care and Share program. It's a community outreach charity, and she's one of many crafty volunteers for Care and Share. She's made baby clothes, fiddle muffs, and crocheted baby blankets as well. Now, there isn't much for knitting news, but we do have quite a few questions to tackle. But first is a comment from the last episode. Last week, Kaz had left a question or comment asking about what to do when she sees so many knitting mistakes in her work, so she gets frustrated and she quits. So I had told her that she just needs to keep working on the project and not quitting until she's done. She can always rip it out after. There's no reason you have to keep your project. You can rip out the yarn and use it again. But you can't progress if you don't keep learning and practicing those new skills. And Kitten left a great comment. I liked your advice about not giving up on a project just because you've discovered a mistake. Most of the time, nobody but you noticed it. The only way to get better at knitting is to knit. Beginner knitters beat themselves up for not being perfect. Like anything else, it doesn't happen overnight. So that was a great contribution to that comment from last week. So thank you so much for that. And I've mentioned it before, but I'm going to mention it again. If you have thoughts or opinions to share, you're more than welcome to share them. We can all learn and grow from each other. I certainly don't know all there is to know about knitting, and I learn a lot from the comments that people leave. So as we talk about things this week, be sure to leave your comments and your thoughts as well. So our first question is from Asuga. I would love help on seaming sweaters neatly and with less bulk. I feel like when I try to seam a sweater, the seam always ends up bulky, which makes it uncomfortable. Now, there's always going to be some bulk. You can't really avoid it, even if you're using, I'm not sure what seaming methods you've tried, but I generally choose mattress stitch. I find it not necessarily the easiest to work, but I can look at the right side of the work as I'm doing the seam, so I can make sure it looks good. Most other methods you have to do like normal sewing. You've got the right sides together and the wrong sides facing you, and you're doing like, I don't know, a back stitch or something, or whip stitch or anything like those. Then you can't actually see what it looks like on the front. But there are some ways, like if you're using mattress stitch, generally you work, you have a selvage stitch and then you have the next stitch over, and you work in you use that strand of that running thread between those two stitches. But if the yarn is bulky or if the seam's feeling bulky, you can do it right in the middle of that selvage stitch. So you're only using half a stitch to work your mattress stitch seam, and that will make it half as bulky, really. You can give it a try and see how it looks, and of course you can always take it out. It's not permanent when you're doing a mattress stitch like that. The only drawback to that is selvage stitches are usually really messy looking. So when you're using half a stitch, you end up with a whole stitch that shows, but it's sort of the wonky edge stitch. So it ends up not quite as neat looking as using a whole selvage stitch. But I'm going to link a video below. Roxanne Richardson, she has a video demonstrating using a whole stitch and a half a stitch. So you'll find that linked below. And a few more things you could do. You could swatch whatever you're using for your yarn. Knit like maybe cast on 10 stitches and do 2 little swatches like that, and then practice different seaming methods to see which one you like and which one is the least bulky for the project that you're working on. And as with anything, if you need that yarn, you can take it out and maybe give it a wash or just use a steam iron. Don't press it right against the fiber, of course, depending on the fiber content of the yarn, and you can just reuse that yarn again. So it's not completely wasted if you're swatching. And I did do a few live streams last year that I demonstrated different ways to sew knitted fabric together. Mattress stitch, but then there was also a back stitch and a crochet seam, and I think another one. So I'll link to those live streams as well, and I'll try to link right to the demonstration so you can see the different ways. So you can try and make your little swatches and try out these different methods to see which one produces the least amount of bulk. Now, if anybody has a preferred method for sewing up their garments that they think doesn't produce like a bulky seam, please leave a comment and I'll share it next week. And the next question's from Michelle. How can I close the gap when going from a knit to a purl? And I'm a right-handed knitter, and Norwegian purl was not for me. Okay, the first thing you could do is try to work on the tips of your needles when you're making that transition. Sometimes like when you're knitting right along and you are working on the barrel of the needle and then you're pushing your right needle through so it's also on the barrel, you're making the stitches larger. So you could try to work that knit in that purl, just in that spot, try to work them right on the tips, and that will keep them smaller. And then the next thing you can do, and this is the one that didn't really work for me, but I think, well, I'll tell you why in a second, but when you get to the knit and you're inserting to purl, give that yarn a tug to get rid of some of that excess and then hold it tight, tighter than your normal tension as you're knitting that first purl. But then the real secret here is to go back to your normal tension right after that. And this is where I had trouble. I would keep a really tight tension. So it didn't really matter. I was making everything tight and not just that one spot. So you have to be really careful about using this and just make sure that you're just pulling in that one spot, that one purl stitch after a knit. You're giving it a tight tug and then holding it tightly as you knit. And that can get rid of some of that yarn. That might be enough to help you. And let me see. Oh, the last one is to wrap the yarn clockwise. I always forget which way it goes. Usually in a standard, when your stitches are seated western with the right leg in the front, you get that by wrapping the yarn counterclockwise around your needle. But it takes more yarn as you're moving from a knit to a purl. So if you're knitting right now and you're working that, then stop and look. This is the best way to learn things, is just to look at what you're doing. I know it seems so basic, but sometimes we just don't look and we just knit along and don't pay attention. But if you stop and look, you can see how much yarn it takes to go from a knit stitch in the back to a purl stitch in the front, and then that whole wrap around the needle counterclockwise. Well, if you wrap it clockwise instead, it takes a lot less yarn. But the only thing to remember is that by wrapping it that way, you're reseating that stitch. Usually if you're using the Western standard mount, then you've got the right leg of the stitch in the front. But if you wrap it clockwise, you're going to put the right leg in the back. So if you're knitting flat, you've purled that stitch, wrapped it clockwise. When you come to that stitch on the other side, it's going to present as a knit stitch, but will have that different stitch mount. So you have to knit it through the back legs. But if you're knitting in the round, it's going to stay as a purl stitch presenting to you. So you'll have to purl it through that back leg. So it can feel confusing at first, wrapping the yarn differently and paying attention. But after a while, you'll see that stitch right away, that it's not seated the same way. And it does use quite a bit less yarn, and that could be enough to compensate for that baggy stitch or that space between that knit and a purl. And I'm also going to link a few videos for this as well. We're going to have a long list of videos today. Now, Bryan has discussed this extensively on her YouTube channel. So I'm going to link 2 videos from her where she discusses this enlarged purl before knit. And I don't know if one of them includes this one, but she had one where she had a little swatch and she just pulled the needles out and she demonstrated how much space there really is between each knit and a purl and how they splay forward and backward. And you've got all of that distance. And that's what gives it that looseness, especially in a knit one, purl one. You can see sometimes the knits just don't look so great. It's because of all of the movement of that yarn from back to front. So maybe one of these methods will work for you, Michelle. I hope so. So the next question is from Dory Knits. How do you get past your fear of knitting something complicated, especially if you don't get negative and positive ease? So I think there's really 2 questions in there that we're going to address. So the first one is that fear of working on something complicated. And I really loved knitting when I started knitting because I realized it was not like sewing. If you've ever sewn anything before, you pick your pattern, you get your fabric, you pin out the pattern, you cut out that fabric. And if you've made a mistake, not much you can do about it at that point, especially if you made it too small. I mean, you can always make it smaller, but you can't make it bigger. You don't have that problem with knitting. If you don't like it, you pull your needles out, you rip the yarn out, and you can use the yarn again. There's no rule that says you can't reuse yarn. I have pulled out yarn for so many projects. I've completed sweaters, worn them for a while, decided, I don't want this, or it's too big, or something's not quite right. Rip it all out, use the yarn for something else. Nothing wrong with that at all. You can reuse it. I've even done a design recently where when I was working on it, it just wasn't coming out right. And I think I ripped that out 4 times The yarn, perfectly fine. It was actually, I made a note to say how great that yarn was because I could rip it out so much and retry and it still held up really well. Now, of course, you can't do this for something sticky like a mohair yarn, but in most cases, you can just rip it out and do it again. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. We learn from our mistakes. The more mistakes you make, the more you're going to learn. I know we don't like to make mistakes because it makes us feel stupid or awkward or so many other things, but it's the best way to learn. And honestly, the more advanced you get, I'm not saying I'm a super advanced knitter, but the more complicated things you try, the bigger your mistakes. I make big mistakes now, but it's okay because I can figure out how to deal with them and fix them. So fear is stupid. There's no reason to be scared of trying something. And I know a lot of people will say, well, you need to knit something really simple and try simple stuff until you feel like you can try something more advanced. And I think that's hogwash. I think you should knit what you want to knit. Now, it might not come out absolutely perfect if you don't have the skills right away to knit that thing, but you can't learn those skills until you start tackling things that require those skills. So knit what you like to knit what you want to knit. I don't think you should strive for perfectionism. I know that's a hard one as well. I struggle with that sometimes. I try to find the place between perfectionism and good enough and just stay in that area. But you can't get over that fear unless you just step out and try something new. But like I said, it's just yarn and needles. You can rip it out. You can do it again. You can make mistakes and fix them. It's not like sewing where once you cut that material, you are stuck with however you cut it. Now, if anybody else has any advice or words or tips for Dory Knits about this issue, about fear of knitting complicated things, then please share your advice and we can discuss this more in future episodes. Now, the second part of her question was understanding negative positive ease, and especially with garments, then this can be very important. So I'm going to link to the Craft Yarn Council, and they explain the basic amount of ease for garment style or the way you want your garment to fit. But ease, all that is the amount of space between the garment and the body. So if you think about a t-shirt that you're wearing, t-shirt that I'm wearing now, I could pinch the side and I'm holding a good 2 inches of fabric on one side, and there's probably the same on this. So it might be 4 inches of ease in this t-shirt. I'm not really being exact right there, but that's the amount of space between the garment and my body. Now, if you think of the socks on your feet, that would be negative ease or no ease. Well, negative ease because that sock has to stretch to fit over my foot, because the sock itself, if I were to take out a tape measure and measure the sock, the circumference of the sock is probably smaller than my foot. So when I pull it on, it's stretching to accommodate the size of my foot. So that is negative ease when the garment is smaller than the body part it's going over. That's negative ease. Positive ease is when there is space, positive space between the body and the garment. And this can vary from one garment to another. You might want a really oversized sweater, like, let me see, Joji Locatelli's boxy sweater is a good example. That's very oversized. We're talking more than 6 inches of ease. It's a big box and it really comes out far from your body. There is lots of space between that garment when you pull it out and your body. Then at the other end of that would say like a ribbed tank top. That is the exact measurements of your body. There's no negative ease because you don't have to stretch it out at all, but it just fits your body. So it just means no ease. And then you can have other amounts of positive ease. You could have just a standard fitting sweater, might have a couple inches of positive ease, meaning that if you measured your bust and then measured that sweater, there might be 2 more inches of around of diameter of that sweater compared to your body. So all ease is the amount of space that's between your garment and the body. And depending on what you're knitting, you'll want more or less ease. If you're knitting a hat, you'll probably want it to stay on your head and not fall in your eyes. So at least the brim is going to have a little bit of negative ease to hold it in place. But sweaters can vary from no ease, even some negative ease if you want a tight fitting tank top, to lots of positive ease. So those are the 2 words if you think positive and negative. Negative, of course, you're subtracting from it. So it's going to be smaller than the body part. And then positive means more and more and more. So the more positive ease you add, the bigger the garment is compared to your body shape. Then there's a question from Beatrice. Is there any basic level of knitting that you recommend before taking the Master Hand Knitting program? I've been knitting for a long time, but I seem to knit the same things over and over. Not really an adventurous knitter. Thanks for the video. So I don't think you need to have any like level of skill, because it's sort of like a research program. You're going to learn everything that you need to know to prove that you know it while you do the program. I had only been knitting, I think, about 6 months when I started the program. So you do not have to be advanced at all. The first level just covers increases and decreases, basic lace, basic cables, learning to swatch and measure for gauge, all those basic things. The project is a mitten, so you could practice knitting some mittens, but they provide the pattern for that as well. So I don't think, you don't have to be a certain level to start the program. But what you do have to realize is that they don't give you all the answers. They ask you a lot of questions and expect you to go out and find the answers. So it's definitely research heavy. You'll have papers to write for each level, book reviews, lots of questions to answer. It can feel intimidating because there's quite a bit of writing, but if you just do a little at a time, then it's not, I don't think it's super difficult. Like, it's definitely doable. I mean, I'm doing it. I'm on the 3rd level. It's doable. Many people have done this. But to answer your question, no. If you've got the basics down, then you can jump right into this. I will say though, if you're feeling nervous about it, then they have like some mini programs. They're a good place to start so you can get an idea of what this process is like. Now because I was such a new knitter, I went with, they have one called the Basics. And it was, at the time, I think it's still taught by her, Arenda Holiday. She's like the head of the whole organization and the editor of Cast On, or the chairman, I don't know what, the CEO, I don't know what her title is, but she's the one who sort of teaches you. But this one, it does come with all the information that you need, and you knit the swatches and you mail them to her. And she tells you, she evaluates your work. So you can get an idea of the process. And it's a very small, it doesn't take very long. It's like 3 little levels, but just like not very many swatches, maybe 6 for each. Instead of like with the master program, you're knitting about 20 swatches and sending in a whole binder all at once. So this one is like very small in an envelope. But you get an idea of the process before tackling like the first level of the program. But that's not necessary either. But it's nice if you're feeling not so confident about your skills. But she's very nice to work with, and everything's very detailed and organized. But you can certainly jump right into the master's program. As long as you can knit already, then you learn everything as you go, as you research for each of the swatches and everything like that. So if you want to do it, then do it. I encourage you to do it because it's such a good learning experience. And last question is from Fawn. I'm curious about increases and decreases. I know some go to the right and some go to the left, but not why or how to do them. I would like to know why certain increases or decrease stitches are chosen. Okay, so a lot to discuss there, a lot to unpack. We're not going to cover how to work increases. There's so many YouTube videos on how to work all the different increases. You can look at them by yourself. But why they're chosen and how designers would choose them, we can cover that part. Okay, so there are some increases and decreases that do not have a slant. Like if you work a make one open, you lift the little bar, you knit right into it, sort of like if you missed a yarn over, it's the same kind of a thing. It doesn't have a slant, it's just an open increase. But many, many, many of them, most of them do. So let's start with the 2 basic decreases, knit 2 together and SSK. So envision them as like if you were going to knit them. You've got the 2 stitches on your left needle and you're inserting into the second stitch and then into the first, wrapping or knitting them together, and that second stitch is sitting on top. So if you've got 2 stitches on your needle and you're inserting here first, this one's going to end up on top. And as I'm looking at it, it's leaning off to the right. It's probably opposite for you right now, but do this with your fingers and you'll see what I mean. That second stitch sits on the top, leans off to the right. Now if you have those 2 stitches and you've slipped them and moved them around, that is just a change of the stitch mount. We're not going to get into all of that right now. But then you knit them through the back legs, but you're knitting through this one first, so it's going to end up on top. Look at that. That's leaning off to the left. So when you're thinking of those 2 decreases, the stitch you're inserting into first determines the slant. So when you're knitting that knit 2 together, you're going to that second stitch, it's leaning to the right. You're knitting into that first stitch and then into the second stitch, and it's going to lean off to the left. So that gives you an idea of how that works. Now, they're done that way because you want to mirror your increases or decreases. And that means, like, say you're working a sweater like I am right now and I'm doing the armhole shaping. I don't want to work a knit 2 together at each end because they're going to lean off in the same direction, and you don't want that. You want them to be mirrored, leaning in different directions so they look like a mirror image of each other. So that's why we use the SSK. Another option would be the SKP, where you slip a stitch, knit a stitch, and then slip that stitch over. It does the same thing. You slip that stitch, but then you're slipping it over. It's leaning off to the left. So we pair those decreases to get mirror images of each other. So we're not working all of our increases in one slant. And the same goes for our increases. If you think of a make 1, where you lift that running bar and you can twist it to the right or you can twist it to the left. And it's the twist that gives it the slant. The actual stitch you're making doesn't have a slant. It's that running bar. When you lift that bar up and you twist it, that gives a slant to the right or to the left. And that's what you're looking at when you're looking at a right-leaning or a left-leaning increase. And the same thing goes for that. You don't want them all to be leaning in the same direction. You want them leaning in opposite directions so they look like mirror images of each other. Now, designers can use make 1 stitches. They could use like lifted increases. The same goes for that, a right and left lifted increase. You can look up how to knit them, but they have a certain slant. Not the increase does slightly, but it's the stitch that's worked into it. It opens up that leg a little more and it leans off to the right and to the left. So a designer chooses them based on how they want them to look. Now you might want them to run in the same direction as the slant. Now let's say we're back to our decreases. Knit 2 together, leans off to the right. An SSK leans off to the left. So if I'm decreasing my sweater and it's decreasing this way, it's leaning off to the left. So I can choose to use a knit 2 together, and that decrease is going to be the opposite of the slant. And that is called, I want it full fashioned, where you can, because you actually see like the decrease is going in the opposite direction of the slant of the fabric. So they really stand out. And you can see that a lot in like machine made sweaters where they work those decreases near the seam so you can see that they're obviously in opposite directions. The other choice is to work in SSK, and that goes in the same direction as the slant, so it's not as noticeable. So that one's called a blended decrease because it blends into the fabric. So sometimes you'll see a pattern that will tell you work in SSK at this edge and then work in knit 2 together at this edge because it's going to slant in this direction. They want you to blend those decreases in with the slant of the fabric itself. But it's really a choice for the designer to make which way, if they want those decreases to slant with the fabric or be opposite so they really stand out. Or you can make your own choices as well. If you don't like that design element, then you can change it. Hopefully that answers that. If anybody has any thoughts to share about that, please share them. We can discuss that some more next week as well. So that is all of our questions. That was a lot of questions this week. So let's get into our discussion, and we are starting our discussion about plant fibers. We have wrapped up animal fibers. We covered them all, I hope. Oh, and last week, Jane left a comment about a good book recommendation, The Fleece and Fiber Source Book by Deborah Robson and Carol Icarius. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name. She says it's an easy to read format, lots of pictures of the animals along with the fibers, maps of where they're located, and best uses for the fibers. So if you've enjoyed this discussion and you want to have a book on hand that explains more about these different fibers and when you'd want to use them, then her recommendation. I'll put a link to it down below, The Fleece and Fiber Source Book. Now, before we get into our discussion about plant fibers, let's just recap the basic categories for those who are new to this discussion. So we have animal fibers. We've discussed quite a few of them, hopefully all of them that I'm aware of. We covered yak last week, but of course there's wool, mohair, angora, cashmere, silk, lots of different fibers you can knit with. And in general, all of these have some elasticity. Wool has the most, others have a varying amount. They're all warm, they're lightweight. I think that's it. But you need to, most of them require like special care. You can't just throw them in the washer and dryer because especially wool will felt. Some of the other fibers will as well, I think. I'm not sure. But they still need to be treated gently. Then we have plant fibers like cotton and linen. These are, and then along with those, we're going to call them the biosynthetic fibers. These are like synthetics, but they use plant matter instead of like petroleum-based things like synthetics would use, but like bamboo. But they need some sort of a process to turn them into usable fiber for knitting. So something like bamboo, you can't just pull down a piece of bamboo and start knitting with it. It has to be broken down in some manner. So there is like a synthetic process to turn the natural thing into usable fiber. So I group them with plant fibers because their characteristics are all basically the same. All of them are generally not elastic. They can be heavy, but they are breathable, they're moisture wicking, they're strong, and they generally have very good drape. Then we have our synthetic fibers, which of course are man-made products from beginning to end. Man-made process, man-made materials, all of it is synthetic. Now, they are very warm, generally, very inexpensive, usually very easy to care for, but they're not biodegradable like the other categories because they are natural fibers. They will degrade with time. Like you throw them in a landfill, they are going to degrade over time. But those are the basic categories, and we're going to go into more depth about the different synthetics after we finish with plants. But we've done animals, now we're going to focus on plants. We've already talked about linen as well, way back in January, I believe. So we won't be addressing linen again, but this week we will focus on cotton, which is a very common fiber, and there's actually a lot to say about this one. Now, this one's actually one of the oldest textile fibers. I've got a picture here that you can see of this sock. There aren't many existing historical pieces because, like other natural fibers, they decompose over time. But some things have been discovered, including this stocking that's knit in cotton, was discovered in Egypt in the 12th century. Now, this was knit from the toe up to the leg, and then the heel was made last. So maybe like that first afterthought heel. I don't know. So cotton is grown in hot climates around the world. China, Egypt, South America, the southern United States are all cotton producing areas. But it comes in various grades, with Egyptian and Sea Island cotton at the top of the list. So let's talk about the types of cotton. There is upland cotton. This is 95% of the cotton grown in the US. Now, if a product says it's 100% cotton or 100% US cotton, then this is probably the type of cotton that it is. Now, this is hard wearing. Now, this is probably like what you would call like the lowest grade of cotton. You'd often see this in the big box store, the worsted weight cotton dishcloth yarn, like Bernat Handicrafter and those types of cotton dishcloth yarn that we've all knit dishcloths with. This would probably be upland cotton. Then there is Pima cotton. This is considered the finest cotton because of its long, soft fibers. It's durable and strong, as well as very soft. Now, many soft cotton yarns that are commercially available are made with Pima cotton, and they probably will say on the label that they are Pima cotton. Then there is Egyptian cotton. This is actually in the same family as the Pima cotton, but the only difference is that it is grown along the Nile in Egypt. Then there's Sea Island cotton. This one's originally grown in South Carolina, but now primarily grown in the Caribbean. It's extremely soft and strong, and presumably Queen Victoria's handkerchiefs were made especially from this cotton. Now, you can find this in knitting yarns sometimes, probably not as common as Pima cotton, but it is available if you look. And then there is a special category, mercerized cotton. Now, this is cotton, but it's coated in a sodium hydroxide before washing. So this increases the strength, makes it easier for dyes to absorb. And it has a noticeable sheen and luster. This is what you'll often see used for like lace doilies. It's this kind of shiny cotton. Now, there's actually more cotton variations, but this like covers most of what you'll see in the yarn world. You'll see that upland cotton in the big box store dishcloth yarn, Pima cotton for a lot of the cotton yarns that are available for garments. And then sometimes you'll find that Sea Island cotton or Egyptian cotton. Now there is a major downside to cotton. It takes a lot of water and fertilizer and pesticides to grow them in large amounts. So organic cotton is starting to be, or is a thing, because it has less of a harmful impact, less fertilizer and pesticides. I'm not sure how they use less water for it, but there are practicing ways to grow cotton to make it more environmentally friendly. Now, as far as the knitting with cotton, cotton is hard on the hands, even if it feels really soft, because it's not as elastic as animal fibers. If you think of an elastic, you can stretch it and let it go, and it stretches and it comes back to its original shape. Cotton and other plant fibers don't do that. Whatever they are, they're like a little rope. They're going to stay that way. So as you're knitting, there's no give like there is with an animal fiber. You think of an elastic, it's got some give. So as you're knitting, it's easy to knit because of that give. You don't get that with cotton yarn. So it can be hard on the hands as you knit. But its advantages include, well, certain types of cotton, very soft. It's non-allergenic, it absorbs moisture, it dries quickly, it's breathable, it's durable, and it's very strong when wet. And a few disadvantages: it's not elastic, that's the big one. It's prone to stretching, which of course, because it's not elastic, and it can stretch out. And this is also exacerbated because of the weight. It's very heavy fiber compared to animal fibers. Now, when you're selecting patterns that use cotton, the first thing to do is look for patterns that already use plant fibers, or primarily plant fibers if it's a mix of fibers, because the designer took those qualities of that plant fiber in mind as they were creating the design. You don't have to be super cautious about this. If a pattern's knit with linen, you could probably knit it with cotton and it's going to be okay, because they're both plant fibers. They both share some of the same traits. But I would not take a pattern that was knit in wool and just assume I could knit it in cotton as well. So the first thing I would do is look for patterns that use seams, because those seams add structure. Because cotton doesn't have elasticity, which means it's not going to hold its shape. Wool will hold its shape because of that elasticity. It will stretch out, but it bounces back into its shape. Cotton, on the other hand, is very heavy, and it will tend to stretch and grow and sag and droop because there's no elasticity to help it hold its shape, and the heaviness of the fiber itself. So if you give it some seams to hold on to, then that can help minimize some of that stretchiness, or the non-stretchiness, the heaviness that will develop. But there are plenty of seamless patterns that are meant to be for plant fibers, but this is done in a few different ways. You can find plant fibers that use a certain type of structure in the yarn itself to provide some structure. Like a chainette yarn, if you look really closely at it, it's almost like a little tiny I-cord. So they've taken that yarn and they've already knitted it into an I-cord, and that makes it, it's like a hollow tube, so it's got some lightness to it already, and it's added some structure by knitting it up into this tiny tube, or chainette as it's called. So if you use a yarn like that, then you can get away with seamless garments. Another thing to do is to, you can add some stitch patterns to the body. Like say you're knitting a tank top. Sometimes if it's knit seamlessly, a tank top or a t-shirt style, if it's knit seamlessly, these plant fibers can sort of bias off to the side. The body of the sweater will twist to the side. You can have something that includes like some stitch patterning in there, and that can reduce that as well. But you'd want to avoid heavily textured designs because, well, for one thing, it's going to be hard on your hands as you knit because that fiber is not very elastic. And it really does show like all your tension issues, especially with cables and things like that. They're hard to knit, and it shows all of your bed tension. It's really obvious in a cotton yarn. Plus, if it's something like cables, those take more yarn anyway. And if you're knitting that in cotton, so you've already got a heavy garment, and then you're adding cables, which takes even more yarn, which makes it even heavier. I don't know if you've ever heard of anybody who decided to take a sweater pattern and then just knit it in some cotton yarn that they found at the big box cotton, which is very heavy. And then they wonder why the sweater keeps sagging and so giant and oversized, because the weight of that fiber is so much heavier than the same amount of wool yarn. So it adds to the bulk and the weight, and it just adds up. All of those negative things add up. It has tons of positive things about it, but those few negatives really do make a difference in the things that you choose. But I would choose cotton for light summer t-shirts and tank tops. Even if they're seamless, you can get away with it by using a chainette yarn or finding something with some stitch patterning to keep it from biasing off to the side. Things you can do to mitigate that, or you can find it in a blend with a little bit of wool. Wool is great and breathable even for summer. And cotton is great for household goods because it's moisture wicking. Is it moisture wicking? I can't remember now. Well, it's breathable and it does absorb moisture, not moisture wicking. But it dries quickly and it's non-allergenic. So all of those household things, it's great for that. And then of course you've got the mercerized cotton, so you can make like lace doilies with that. Pima cotton is great for baby items because it's usually washable. So it'd be great for things that you want easy care. It's great for lightweight shawls because it does have good drape. And then placemats and bath mats. I have some recycled t-shirt yarn and I use that to make a bath mat for my bathroom. Hard to knit with. It was hard to knit with, but the bath mat is great. It's really sturdy and it just feels like a t-shirt. So that is the basics of cotton yarn. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any comments or questions to add, then we can address those next week. Now, before we talk about what's been on my knitting needles, I just want to share the sponsor for the week, which is Knit Picks. They are having a sale on their fixed circulars right now. You can get 20% off their fixed circular needles. I love my interchangeable needles, but I do keep a few fixed needles around as well. I love them for my sock knitting because my interchangeable set, I think it starts the US 2, and of course you need a smaller needle size for your socks. So I got some fixed needles in the sizes I like for socks, 1.5 US 1.5, US 1, and with a long cable so I can use them for magic loop and do 2 socks at a time or anything like that. I like magic loop for socks if I'm not knitting them on double points or something like that, and I always use my fixed circulars for that. So if you're looking for a good deal on some fixed circulars, then you can get them 20% off right now at Knit Picks. Now, off my needles, I finally finished my master sweater. It's up on the shelf right now, but I'm going to take a little video and I'll put it right here so you can see it. The collar was all that I had left to finish. And thank you, Brenda. Last week you mentioned Roxanne Richardson's video about how she redid her collar. I watched that. That was very helpful. Thank you. So I decided to go with whip stitching the live stitches. What I did for the collar is I picked up the stitches. That was quite a process because I wanted to match. I wanted to do like sort of a pattern to run into the collar instead of just like a 2x2 rib. So I got that worked out and then I just knit it twice as long as I wanted it, folded it to the inside, and then I didn't bind them off first. I just connected the pickup row to the live stitches on my needle, 1 stitch at a time. So it was like just whip stitching. I'd go underneath the head of the pickup stitch and then take the stitch off my needle and then just continue that around until I was finished, and I matched up the pattern as much as possible so my collar wouldn't be sort of sideways or anything like that. So it's all finished. Everything's woven in. I need to give it like just a little steam blocking just to make sure everything's really set and ready to go, but it's all done. So my next thing to do is to get the pattern finished and then finalize everything else in my box so I can get it mailed out. And part of that process is getting all of my swatches, these are all of them right here, into my binder. My pages are mostly done. All of the papers, each swatch has what they call a swatch information sheet that goes with it. Nothing too complicated. You just talk about the yarn that you use, the needle sizes, and then if you had to do anything specific for that swatch, then you include the information there. And then your references to show that you researched that particular swatch. And then my other final project, which I forgot, I have not woven the ends in yet, so I still have to finish this. You have 2 final projects for level 3. Your sweater and a hat, and you get a choice. One of the items has to be stranded color work and the other item has to have cables, and you can decide which is which. So I went with the cabled sweater and a Fair Isle stranded color work hat. And if this is self-designed as well, I picked out the different stitch motifs, and I call this my cherry on top tam because it looks like whipped cream and a cherry, at least to me. But I wanted something that was more colorful, so I used like different shades of yellow for the background and then different shades of blue for the pattern, and you can really see the blues right there. And a corrugated rib for the brim. I really like how the brim came out, but I realized I did not weave in the ends. So that is my other project, is to get those all woven in neatly. But even the inside looks pretty good, I think. Not that I'd wear this out inside out, but it looks pretty good. Both of those final projects, I used Knit Picks yarn. I used, for most of my swatches, I used Peyton's Classic Wool Worsted, and then for my projects I used Knit Picks Palette for the hat. That's a fingering weight wool yarn, great for stranded color work. And then I used Knit Picks Wool of the Andes Worsted, but the bare yarn, no color or dye added, for the sweater itself. And the next thing on my needles is a sweater for my daughter. Got the yarn running around here. This is the back. It's almost done. I just did the armhole shaping. And I think I've got like a couple more rows, and then I've got to do the neckline shaping. So then the back will be finished. And plain stockinette, nothing too hard here. Pretty easy. I am going to make a video of all of this though. So it's sort of like a knit a cardigan video, like all the things you need to know, like how to bind off stitches for an armhole and things like that. So if there are questions you'd like to have addressed in the video, please include them in a comment, and I can make sure that I include that topic in the video itself. But it's coming right along. This is another Knit Picks yarn. This is the Brava, I think. They're acrylic yarn, machine washable and dryable. My daughter wanted something that she could just wash and dry. I did tell her it has to be washed on a gentle cycle at least, but something very simple. Now the pattern is a pattern from Amy Herzog's Ultimate Sweater book. This book right here. I'm using the set in sleeve cardigan formula pattern. She's got a lot of different patterns in here, but they're all basic patterns that you sort of add elements to. So this is the one I'm using as the base. I'm going to add a shawl collar and some patch pockets to it. Now this particular sweater comes in 3 different yarn weights, fingering, sport, and worsted. I think it's 12 sizes. So all of the patterns in here, she covers all the basics, like a drop shoulder sweater, satin sleeve, yoke sweater, and then each one there's a pullover and a cardigan, and then 3 yarn weights for each one. And then has like a chart format that you follow, very similar to Ann Budd's books, but I think more, I don't know, more updated, I guess. She's got lots of information outside of those patterns where you can add different stitch patterns and elements, how to swatch and do your measurements and everything. It's all really well organized in a good book. And she even has a section in the back that has lots of patterns that she uses that basic formula and then adds all of those different elements. You can see some of them here where she adds different things to create these different designs. I really like this one down here too. But she uses basic patterns and then shows you how she adds to them. Then I am making good progress on a new shawl design. This is using Gauge Dye Works. They're 2-ply fingering. Where's my other needle? There it is. Okay, let's see if I can get this switched around here. So Whiskey in a Teacup is the colorway from Gauge Dye Works on their 2-ply fingering weight yarn. They also have the shawl behind me uses the same colorway, but on their MCN, their merino cashmere sock yarn. But both yarns are lovely. I really like this one as well. I'm using the same sort of stitch patterns, but in an asymmetrical shawl design. So it's coming along. Started up here at one point, and then as the color changes, I switch to a different stitch pattern. So I've got a section of stockinette between each of these other very basic stitch patterns, but I had to do a bit of math because just the way it was working out, I had to make sure I was adding 2 stitches for every 2 rows instead of the 1 that I had started with, because then it was changing my stitch patterns too much. I know that sounds weird, but anyway, but it's making, and I'm actually liking it because the wingspan is going to be really long without the shawl being super large. And it actually looks kind of small right now. And I'm almost finished with the colors. I've got this section to finish and then one more section of this dark pink, and then it'll be like one big large gray section like the one back there. And that will be in other textured stitch patterns, some eyelets and things like that. And then probably finishing with a picot edge. So it's the same very simple stitch patterns, and then you just have like the shawl shaping. I'm using like lots of increases along one edge and then decreasing along this edge to get that asymmetrical shape. So that one's coming along nicely. And then I'm knitting some fingerless mitts for my father-in-law. I've just gotten started. This isn't even the mitt right now. This is just doing a swatch. I'm using Jamieson and Smith. They're 2-ply jumper weight in this pretty mossy green color. I won a giveaway from the Irish Knitting Podcast, and this was the gift, this really pretty bag and 3 skeins of this yarn. So I had knit my father-in-law some fingerless mitts before, convertible ones with the top that folds down, but I didn't make the top long enough, so it tends to gap open between like the fingerless mitt part and that part. So instead of like redoing those, I just thought I'll just knit him a new pair, and this yarn is perfect for that. So, but I've never used this yarn before, so I wanted to do a little swatch with it, and I think I'm going to stick with this needle size. We shall knit a swatch and make sure. I want them to be nice and sturdy and warm for him. So I think these are US 1.5. So we'll see how they look on that. And the pattern, I was going to do, the giveaway included one of Sam's patterns as well, but I decided just to do something plain instead of like the cable pattern on the top. And then I remembered I had this book on the shelf. We're going to talk more about this one in a little bit, this Mitten Handbook, and I decided, oh, I'll just pull that out, and it does have a convertible mitt pattern in here. But it walks you through how to design your own mitts, so I just can't follow a pattern sometimes, so I'm just going to knit my own. I mean, if you've knit mittens and you kind of learn, and if you use the yarn that you like all the time, you kind of learn, it's like a hat, you know, like how many stitches to cast on and how to knit a mitten. So I know the basics of it, and I've knit 2 pairs of convertible mittens before, so I think I can just try it out for myself. And I've looked at different ways to get that convertible mitten top. And the method I'm going to use is I'm going to knit the fingerless mitt first, and then like cast on some stitches, and then pick up and knit some stitches along the back of the fingerless mitt, and then knit that in the round to the top, and then like a regular mitten, bind it off. But I've also seen a method where you use a provisional cast on and do like a little short row, like a short row toe, but it's the top of the mitten instead. I did consider that. And I think I've seen one more, but I can't remember now what it was like. But if you know of another method for doing that convertible top on a mitten, I would love to hear about it. I'm exploring the different ways they can be added to just choose the one I want to use. And we'll see how it progresses, but it's not going to be a fancy pattern, but I might write it up and then maybe do a tutorial. And it'd be nice to include different ways to get that mitten top. So if you know of another way to do that convertible top on a mitten, then I'd love to know about that. So that's everything I've been knitting. And of course we have to have a knitting resource to talk about, because it wouldn't be very nerdy if we didn't talk about a book or two. So we are going to talk about that Mitten Handbook. I really like this book. If you like mittens and you like to mix and match, this is a great book. This is by Mary Scott Huff, and the subtitle is Knitting Recipes to Make Your Own, and that's exactly what it is. The first section talks about like the basics, your anatomy of a mitten, and it's just so many pretty pictures, like just lots of colors. I love her choice of colors in here. And design inspiration and theory, and a design worksheet. So she explains like the measurements you should take and how to plan out your design. But then what's really fun is these mix and match elements. She's got different sections: edges, cuffs, thumbs, and tops. And you just mix and match. Like you can pick one from each section and really make your own mitten. And then she's got sections on techniques like gauge and swatching, choosing yarn, measuring, things like that. Then she does include a lot of patterns for inspiration, but it's the mix and match element that really drew me in, because I just have a tendency not to stick to a pattern. There's always something I want to change, but just lovely. They're just such pretty mittens. I think I want to knit that pair. I really like those. The Latvian cuff is nice. Okay, here, I'll give you an example of the components. Well, you can see right there. It starts with some of the pieces, just the pieces themselves. So you would have like something like this. She gives you a little swatch just of that piece. So there's like the edging, and then the instructions for working that. And of course you'd have to adapt them to what whatever yarn weight you're using, because you can adapt it to any weight of yarn, but she gives you like basic instructions. You just have to adapt them. So that those would be like the edgings you could use. And then there's like some really cool cuff patterns that you could use. You could skip the edging and just do an interesting cuff. And of course it has the charts, it has written instructions for each of them. And then you get into like the thumbs, just the thumbs themselves. Here's all the different ways you can add a thumb. Isn't that so neat? Like just not your normal thumb gusset, you know, but so many different ways to put a thumb in there. So, okay, I feel like I'm getting a little nerdy about mittens. And then of course there's like the mitten tops. All of the many ways you can do them right there. And each one has the instructions and like a picture of what they would look like. And if needed, those don't have them, but if they're needed, there would be the charts for them as well as the written instructions. And then she's got sections on measuring, gauge and swatches, choosing your yarn, and even talking about the difference between knitting them like what I would call the standard way, like from the cuff up to the top. But then she has other methods like knitting them flat side to side, or like the whole thing separately like that. Just really interesting how that could be done. Or knitting them top down as well. And then she has a lot of like beautiful patterns. Those little goldfish things are just adorable. So all of these patterns use different elements from the book, and the patterns will tell you that as well, I think. Oh yeah, like this little blue raspberries, those are so cute. It tells you which elements are included in that particular pattern. So this is just such a fun book. Like if you like to knit mittens, but you want to change things up and just mix and match, you know, then this is a great book. So I'll have a link for this down below. This is the Mitten Handbook by Mary Scott Huff. And that is all for this episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. I'm so happy you joined me today to sit and chat about knitting. And if you have knitting questions you'd love to discuss, leave them in the comments below and we'll chat about them in an upcoming episode. If you're new here, I'll put a playlist right here that you can click on and settle in and watch more episodes of this season's podcast. And I'll see you in the next video.